So let's begin. As an overview of the webinar, I'm going to talk about some general considerations with qualitative data collection, developing your instruments and your questions to ask, sampling and recruitment. Then we're going to hit the big methods of data collection: semi-structured interviews, focus groups, surveys, document analysis, and observations. And we will conclude with some tips for best practices. So, in general, some things you do need to think about with qualitative data collection. It is time-consuming. Collecting qualitative data can take long periods of time. Interviews tend to take between 45 minutes to an hour each. I've had some clients, and some of the interviews I've conducted lasted for 2 hours. And if you have 10, 15, 20 interviews, that can be anywhere from 12 hours to, say, 30 hours or more just to collect the data. How will you record the data you collect? If it's audio recording, will you use your phone? Will you use, say, Zoom or Microsoft Teams? Will you have a digital voice recorder? If you're making observations, you have to think about how you'll record what you're observing: audio, video, your notes, things of that nature. If you're analyzing documents, will you be able to take photographs of the documents? Will you be able to make scans? Will you have to copy by hand? Can you make a virtual copy or a digital copy? These are all things to think about, and I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics when we get to the data collection methods. Ultimately, the biggest general consideration is, what type of data do you need to collect to answer your research questions? Because the data collection method you choose must be in service to your research questions, the purpose of your study, and the problem that you seek to address. So, let's talk about developing your instruments and your questions. First and foremost, as a qualitative researcher, you are the first data collection instrument, but you will also make use of things such as interview protocols, focus group questions, a survey, maybe a survey questionnaire. If you're analyzing documents, you will still have to figure out what questions to ask of these documents. Observations, maybe you're going to have some sort of an observation sheet for recording specific elements of what you observe. You may be the one who has to create this. Oftentimes, you are the one who does have to create these protocols and these questions. So I do think we need to talk about, as you prepare these questions, you want open-ended questions to stimulate responses beyond, yeah, no, good, bad. So you want to think about how you word your questions. Are you excited for the weekend? Will get you a yes, no, not really response. But what excites you about the coming weekend? What are you looking forward to about the weekend? What plans do you have for the weekend? Has at least the potential to get people you're talking to discussing in detail what they have planned. You know, if you're trying to seek perceptions about strategies to help English language learners understand reading comprehension, and you're asking teachers, do your students have primary languages that are other than English? Yes, no. Or can you describe versus, can you describe the differences between a paper written by someone whose first language is English and someone whose first language is something else? Can you describe, do you have an understanding of how language impacts processing of information? Do you understand how different languages construct sentences? Do you understand how people, what are your perceptions? What are your experiences? You want to open up the floor to their responses that will be detailed. You want your questions to be unambiguous. You need to get to the point clearly so that way they can give you the response that hopefully will help you understand their perceptions, their experiences, their worldview. So you need to think about the language you use being clear, but also clear for your participants to understand. As scholars, as students, we spend a lot of time talking about theory. We spend a lot of times using academic jargon. Many of the people who participate in our studies, the people we interview, the people we seek to understand, don't spend a lot of time with that jargon, with academic theory, with academic lingo and discourse patterns. So when we ask questions, we need to think about wording the question so that way our participants can understand what it is that we are asking of them. When you're writing a dissertation, you're writing at a graduate scholarly level. The average adult in the United States, by contrast, has a reading level that is roughly what we call in English 7th grade. So it's roughly middle school. That is the average reading level. So these are people who are intelligent. These are people who understand the world around them and they understand their world. But they don't speak the language of the academy, of the university, with the fluency of those of us who are conducting research. And so we need to make it clear what we are asking them so that way they can understand what they want, what question they want, that we want them to answer. We need to have our questions unbiased in their wording. Why? Because we want to solicit honest responses. We want our participants to tell us what their perceptions are, what their experiences are, but we don't want to lead them to feel that we're asking them to say certain things. And that can be, and it can be harder to unbias our wording because oftentimes we think or we know what we're expecting to find. Let me just see what we have here. How long should an interview take? Jacob asks. That's going to vary. You have to think about how long you have to collect data, how long your participant is willing to give you. Because when you are collecting this data, you do have to think about the time consuming. In general, and as we will talk later, we advise between 30 and 60 minutes. But as I've said, sometimes interviews can take 2 hours. It depends on how much time you have, how much your participants are willing to talk, and how much time they have. Because ultimately, when you are collecting qualitative data, you have to recognize that these people are giving their time and their energy to help you. And so you want to be respectful and you want to be mindful of that. And also you want to think about as you're designing your data collection instrument, you want it to narrow and focus your inquiry. It can be very easy to just ask a bunch of questions. And you probably will have a few what we call general phatic questions. How are you doing? Nice. What do you think of the weather today? How was your drive over here? How's your day been? Some general questions like that, just to sort of get your participants comfortable talking. But you don't want to spend too much time on the phatic communication. It builds the rapport with your participant, but it shouldn't be the bulk of the interview time. Narrow your question focus so that way it's focused on getting the information that you believe will help you answer your research questions. Is this easy to do the first time? No. It takes several times to figure out really what will help you, what will get you the answers and the data you need. So don't feel bad if there are mistakes. Many programs will have you submit your questions to your chair so they can help you. Your chair should be able to help you refine your questions. Your chair should be able to help you see what types of questions will give you the information you need. And you need to ask your chair and your department because you may be required to conduct some form of field test, a mock interview, so that way the school sees if you understand the process of interviewing, and that way they can help you develop those skills before you go into the field to collect data. All of this is something you need to talk about with your school, with your chair, with your department, because not every school requires mock interviews and field testing, but you need to know if you do so you can budget the time to have that done before you start moving forward to collect data. And now I do want to spend a bit talking about an often forgotten about part of data collection, sampling, recruitment, because qualitative data does not use random sampling. It uses non-random sampling. The two most commonly used methods, especially amongst my clients, have been purposive sampling, where you actively seek out candidates to participate in your study who have traits that you are looking for. If you seek to understand the perceptions of English language of teachers in middle school who teach math to English language learners or non-native speakers, then you would likely see, then a random sample of teachers probably wouldn't give you the sample size that you need. So you would purposefully seek out middle school math teachers who teach math to non-native English speakers or English language learners. And so you have to think about your criteria for inclusion, your criteria for exclusion. What are the boundaries of the potential participants? So again, teacher, middle school, math, English teaches to English language learners. Maybe a specific percentage of their students are non-native speakers. Maybe they've been teaching for at least 3 years. Maybe you want those for whom English was not their first language. You have to decide based upon the literature and the research you have done so far what this criteria you are looking for is. And then there is snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is where you have a few participants selected, but then you ask them to put you in touch with others who could participate. and you use that to make your sample size snowball from a teeny tiny ball to a larger ball. Hence, it's called snowball sampling. These are the two most common that we use. Purposive sampling, or purposeful sampling as some call it, usually yields the best results, but it's not a bad idea to have snowball in your pocket just in case you need a few extra participants. And so let's talk about sample size. Your sample size will be smaller than a quantitative study. How large it is dependent upon, again, time, topic, population size. Normally, we think about, with a qualitative sample, somewhere between 12 and 15 participants is a good sample, at least, especially for a dissertation. You want to get people who can provide you with the information. You want to get a variety of perspectives. So hence, you want it large enough to ensure diversity and representativeness of the sample, but it needs to be small enough for an in-depth exploration of the topic. Do remember that the larger your sample size, the more time you will spend transcribing, and the longer data analysis, coding, thematic analysis, etc. will take. So 12 and 15 is a good size. Some of my clients come from schools who mandate a specific minimum number. You rarely want to go over 20, because anything larger than 20 and it starts to get unwieldy. And when you're analyzing the data, you start to struggle with the momentum to keep moving. 12 to 15 is a good number, but you want to be able to go deep, but you also want to have a little bit of breadth of experience. Again, there's no set rule for determining your sample size, and it will always depend based upon your context, population, topic, question, time for data collection, availability of potential participants, etc. Your goal is to achieve data saturation, the point at which no new data emerges from the interviews. When does that happen? It's impossible to say. It happens at a different point for each study. So that's something you have to think about with your sample. How much time, what size is the population you're looking at. A single small community could give you maybe a greater percentage of the overall population, but you still don't want something that will be unwieldy to transcribe and then to analyze. So let's move on to talking about different types of data collection. Semi-structured interviews is probably the most common. A lot of people love it for a variety of reasons. We're talking about a conversation between the researcher and usually a single participant, where the researcher asks a question and the participant provides responses. Because it's one-on-one, it really allows for a deep dive into experiences and perceptions of individuals. It facilitates exploring sensitive topics. A lot of times, if you're dealing with something sensitive, health, mental health, abuse, things of that nature, it's a lot easier to open up if there's only one person. I will get to the question in the Q&A in a second. I do want to finish this. Again, interviews can be time consuming. Most interviews are between 45 and 60 minutes apiece. So if you have 15 participants, you're looking at, say, 12 to 15 hours just to collect the data. And the data you collect is heavily dependent upon the researcher's interviewing skills, how quickly and how well you build rapport, how you handle follow-up questions for clarity and for detail, how comfortable the participant feels with you. Now, the question that Viva asks in the chat is, can I suggest software that transcribes and analyzes data? If you want transcription, I would honestly suggest at the very least Zoom transcriptions. Zoom, you can transcribe through Zoom if you are doing it virtually. If you are doing it face-to-face and you record with an audio recorder, you might need to find a transcription service, or you might need to do it yourself. And transcribing interview data tends to take about 3 times as long as it does to collect the data. And even with Zoom, Teams, Microsoft Word, speech to text, you still need to check the transcript against the audio, because sometimes mistakes happen. Accents can impact it. Rate of speech can impact how well things are transcribed. And so no automated transcription service is perfect. And so you still need to spend some time with your data checking the transcription. As far as analysis, and as far as analysis, there really isn't any good automated analysis. NVivo and MaxQDA offer automated analyses. However, in my experience, what they produce is bunk, and it is so hyper-specific that it renders automated coding meaningless. Analyzing your data is something that you really should be doing yourself so that you are familiar with the data. Michelle mentions using Otter AI that works with Zoom and other uploaded recordings, and it does mistake rhyming words. So sometimes you do have to check it. And I've heard good things about Otter AI, but you do need to, but anything that helps you transcribe needs to be checked. AI doesn't know, 2 and 2, there, and there, your and your, as well as other rhyming words. Accents can be problematic. My native accent is a Saxon German accent. I'm trying really hard to facilitate understanding by removing it. But when my accent comes out, I find that transcription services can sometimes have a difficult time unless you train it to accented English with specifics. So these are things to think about. No automated service is perfect. And even then, going through the data yourself familiarizes you with it, which helps you analyze, interpret, and then write up your results. So if interviews are one-on-one, we're going to move now to focus groups. Focus groups are conversations with small groups. There's often diverse participants discussing a topic guided by a moderator. You, as the researcher, are that moderator. Your goal is to gather collective insights and opinions. Now, why do people like focus groups? Well, you can gather a range of perspectives in one session. Whereas an interview, you had one person giving you their responses. A focus group, you tend to have multiple people. The ideal is somewhere between 6 and 8 participants. So you could get between 6, 7, 8 participants in one recording session, in one data collection session, which speeds up data collection by minimizing the number of collected sessions you need. And so you can gather large amounts of data pretty quickly. A focus group is usually between 45 and 90 minutes. However, if you've ever done any type of small group project, you know that the data, that anything in a group can be influenced by group dynamics, by personalities. Strong personalities tend to talk more. More introverted people might be hesitant to talk. And so as a result, you might not get as deep a dive into the topic, but you might get a broader or a more consensus understanding of the topic. Participants may be hesitant to share sensitive data. And that doesn't just mean traumatic data. That might be anything where they feel they might lose face or they might be looked at negatively in front of by other people. The question is, what if you only have 3 to 4 people for a focus group? Is it acceptable? It's acceptable. Again, what I am mentioning are what are considered the ideal. This is what you really want to try to get as many as you can. 3 to 4 can give you a little bit deeper, but you still have to figure that out. I've had clients who, because of situations, a focus group ended up being 2 people. It happens, but and research shows what the ideal is 6 to 8. You want more than 1, but you don't want over 10. Anything over 10, and it becomes really hard for everyone to get a chance to talk. Two questions: can focus groups meet virtually, or is in-person ideal? In-person is usually ideal for everything, but we are moving toward a virtual world. Sometimes it's easier. Sometimes you don't have a choice. I mean, let's face it, we learned with COVID, sometimes you have no choice but to be virtual. Kim asks, is it wise to conduct both individual and group interviews? I'm going to respond to that with something I've already mentioned, and that is, you have to think about the data you need to answer the question. I will say this: focus groups are easy to conduct, but if you're using coding software to manage and help you with the data, coding software does not allow you to individualize the people who are participating in a focus group. So it will just show that all of the quotes came from focus group 1, focus group 2, which means it can be a little bit unwieldy. These are things to think about. I personally think, and a lot of research suggests, that doing one or the other, simply because an interview protocol and a focus group protocol are different data, are different documents. So it's more you have to think about. It's more that you have to get approved by the IRB, and the skill requirement for facilitating a focus group, making sure everyone feels heard, everyone participates, is different to an extent than it is for conducting one-on-one interviews. It's not just your time, it's your skill set with data collection, it's the data you need. If you feel you may be getting sensitive data, you probably don't want to use a focus group. And so, again, a lot of it is going to be dependent upon your research. And that's something that individually, can't be discussed in the context of a webinar. So from focus groups, let's think about surveys. I know we often think of surveys as quantitative, but you can do surveys with open-ended qualitative questions. Basically, each question things like SurveyMonkey or other. My audio went out? Oh. Okay, let's see. Someone tell me when my audio's coming back in. Okay, my audio's back. What was the last thing anybody heard? Yeah, I'm going to warn you, it might happen again because power just went out. So it's sort of I'm racing against the clock. Okay, surveys. I'm going to try to be quick here because power just went out and I'm having to switch to the fun part of working from a wireless hotspot. Surveys. You want to use structured, open-ended essay-style questions, but you can gather a lot of information this way. SurveyMonkey and things like that make it easier to administer surveys to large numbers of people, which is awesome. And that way you can then, and so it does allow you to get perspectives, especially from a distance. If you can't physically meet or set up a time to interview, a survey isn't a bad way to go. You get remote access, large numbers of participants, but be aware that data gathering may be limited because of question type, the inability to ask follow-up questions, the time that some participants will take to respond. If you're using something like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms, there are character limits, and if you're not, and so some people may talk a bit too much or may type out a bit too much and not be able to finish. And so wording of questions, surveys take time to really craft. If I haven't stressed this enough, I want to stress this now. Taking the time to really think about and craft your questions can save you a lot of headaches in data collection. So let's move on to something like that I enjoy doing, document analysis. Document analysis is when you're looking at, well, documents, written documents, visual documents, newspapers, reports, emails. A lot of the work from my master's degree onward dealt with medieval manuscripts. So manuscript copies of Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, Chrétien de Troyes Percival, ou Le Comte del Graal, the Icelandic sagas, Beowulf, the Toynbee Cooley from Ireland. And so looking at documents is a way to collect more qualitative data. If you're doing contemporary research, newspapers, reports, emails, news broadcast, things like this can be a great way to triangulate the findings from interviews or focus groups to help you get a bigger picture. They can also provide you with some context. They can be conducted remotely, but it's not always the case. A lot of libraries have their newspapers digitized. A lot of newspapers have issues digitized, but it's not 100% accessible because not all newspapers are digitized and not all are accessible free of charge. The British Museum is working on digitizing a lot of its medieval manuscripts. So those that have been digitized, you can access them remotely. For some of the manuscripts I looked at, like presentation copies of Wolfram's Parsifal for my master's degree, For those who are unaware, a presentation copy is a handwritten manuscript that has illustrations, pictures, illuminations, because in the Middle Ages, these copies with these pictures and gold foil and red lettering would be passed around to the audience while the poet or someone else who was literate at the time read the tale publicly. So that way they could look at the pictures and they could see sort of visual depictions of what was going on. The specific manuscripts I was looking at had not been digitized at the time. And so I had to travel to the library that had the copy. And so with document analysis, you have to think about that. You may need to travel. You may need to get access. For things like newspapers, reports, emails, that can be a little bit easier than manuscripts. So specifically for manuscripts like what I had to look at, I had to be vetted, which means I had to send 3 letters of reference from scholars in the field, not just my professors, but scholars in the field, to demonstrate that I was someone who was trustworthy enough to be given access to the manuscript. And at the time, I could not take photographs. So if I wanted to copy down any passage, I had to handwrite it. And so these are things that you have to think about. Depending on the data you collect, you can get some level of objectivity. Test scores, economic data, things of that nature can provide some level of objectivity, but it can also provide limited context. So with test scores for students, you can learn how many people in various demographics scored in a particular range on a test, but you don't know the factors. You know, did a student come sick? I mean, how many of us have gone to school or gone to work when we were sick because we couldn't miss an exam, we couldn't take a day off, something like that? Home life. When I was a college professor, I had students who would sometimes come to class and like, I have to take the test. I'm sorry I'm late, but I was in a car accident on the way over here. Things happen on the way to class, to interviews, to life. And so that's a context that this type of objective data like test score documents don't record. And so these are things that you would miss. And so that's really one of the beauty of things like interview, focus group, where you talk to your participants. You can get context that this type of objective data just doesn't have. And, you know, if you're doing historical work like I've talked about for my own stuff, hey, guess what? Historical record is perpetually incomplete. We never have all of the data we would like. We have to work from the data that is available. And I have found that's a good thing to think about for qualitative research in general. You can't obtain every piece of data, so you need to put forth a good faith effort to collect as much of the best data as is available, so that way you can put forth the best analysis, interpretation, and information that you can. And the last type of data collection I want to talk about is observation. Observation involves you, the researcher, observing and documenting actions, behaviors, and interactions of participants in a natural setting. They can be structured, following some sort of predetermined set of behaviors or actions to observe, or they can be unstructured, allowing you to just observe and document what happens. Researchers may or may not participate. Anthropology as a discipline favors and strongly recommends participant observation. Why? Because when you participate in that which you study, you gain an understanding of the phenomenon that cannot be understood if you just sat and watched people do it. Observation data can provide really rich, in-depth understanding of setting, of behavior, classroom management strategies, teaching strategies, festivals, storytelling competitions, conventions, events, rallies. Any human interaction that we can observe can be turned into data. Can you have the transcript to this Zoom? Sierra, I'm not sure if the transcript comes, but I know you will receive an audio recording. And you can, I'm sure that can be discussed. I do not have a copy of the transcript, so, but you will receive an audio and video recording with the PowerPoint. And so I know that's something that you can get. You can get a lot of data from observation that you can't get from anywhere else. Observation, however, has to be conducted in real time. If you're observing a festival, it has to occur when the festival is occurring. If you're observing classroom behavior, it has to be during that class. And so it's time consuming. Oftentimes you have to go to the location, travel time, time spent in the field, time spent observing phenomenon. These are things that really make this frustrating, and many anthropologists will tell you that the time they spend in the field, which can be from weeks to months to years, can often leave them feeling homesick and isolated. So, but this is something that people do have to consider depending on what it is that you seek to study. And you have to realize that your presence can influence the event. Sometimes people put on a show for an outside observer. Sometimes they put on their best face. Sometimes they don't want you to see how dirty, how messy. I mean, human social interaction is never perfect like we have in models. It's messy, it's real, it's raw. But when there's an observer, people often put on their best face. And so that's something that we have to think about as a limitation. And it can be difficult to gather sensitive, private data from participants because you're in a public setting. And so anthropologists will often combine participant observation with interviews. Often they will pick one or two people that they consider their primary interlocutor, a person who they will talk to help them understand things. The question, how do we deal with human subject matters with observation studies? Same way you do with anything else, with grace, with poise, and you've got to take it as it comes. Human subjects matter, and you still have to get IRB approval to go through this. Hopefully you will be trained on how to do this. It's something that I don't have a lot of experience with because I didn't do this type of research, so I can only talk about what I know friends have said. Two questions from the Q&A. Must our position as an observer always be disclosed? That's a tough question to answer, because we have the question of, because there are ethical considerations and there are safety considerations. Some anthropologists who have studied criminal organizations, gangs, the mafia, drug dealers, things of that nature, have, set forth a precedent that in this instance, not disclosing your positionality to the participants is something that allowed them, one, to gain access, and two, to be safe. So in these instances, you do have to think about it. If you're talking with combat veterans, one thing you have, they will know that you are a researcher, and so they will know, or if you're observing something like, say, basic training, if you're allowed to, which may or may not, the military is rather closed on a lot of matters. If you were to get that, they would know. And you would, but you would need to disclose that to get a security clearance. So these are things that you have to think about. So, should you disclose it? More than likely you should. But you do have to think about, will you be able to get access if you disclose it? Will you put yourself in danger if you disclose that status? And so their hard and fast answers do not really exist in qualitative research. What are the differences between the survey and qualitative and quant? Well, if you've ever taken one of those personality tests online that's asked you to strongly agree, neither agree or disagree, strongly disagree, you have taken a quantitative survey. A quantitative survey does not ask people to type out answers. It gives them usually a Likert scale and asks them to fill out by pushing the button, so that way you can get the Likert spread. Qualitative survey, you still need to collect qualitative data. And so so that's the difference. I know it might seem I'm not trying to dismiss questions by saying there are no hard answers, but there really aren't. You do have to think about who you're talking to, and will it be safe for you to disclose? Will it give you access? With observations, you need to think about, participant, how are you going to get people to sign off agreeing to participate? Is it a public event? Then you have a little bit more leeway, because if you're recording people at a public festival that anyone could attend, like, say, New Orleans Mardi Gras, or Mardi Gras in Mamou, or Carnival in Rio, if it's public, people don't have the expectation of privacy. So you could record the event. If you are interviewing people, then you need individual permission from informed consent. It never hurts to email a festival organizer or an event organizer and say, hey, I would like to come and do some research here. Would that be okay? Getting permission is never a bad thing, unless it puts you in danger physically. So think about that, because that is something that you sometimes have to consider. And if you're going to a setting that you're not a part of, your status as a researcher will probably be pretty clear. So let's now move on from individual methods and talk about some tips for best practices. Okay, before I get to that, Karen asks, are there data collection methods that work better with a multiple case study design? As again, it's not just the case study versus the single case study, multiple case study phenomenology, general. It's what are your research questions? What are you seeking to learn? How much time do you have? How big is your population? Because depending on what you're talking about, for even a multiple case study, you may just use focus. You may need focus groups. You may need individual interviews. You may need observations. It depends on the topic. And so that is something that, as we run close to the end, I don't have a lot of time to get into specifics, and I would like to go through the best practices before our time runs out. So again, consider your research questions and your purpose statement, because the data collection method you choose needs to serve these things. What will get you the best chance at getting the data you need? Think about your research context. Consider your role. These are things, that go hand in hand. Is this something that you really want to spend a lot of time on? Is it something that you want to do quickly? Is this something that you can do by talking to a few people? Do you need to talk? Do you need depth? Do you need breadth? Do you need observations? What is it that you need? You need to think about that type of context, the theory that you're choosing. What will be the best way to get these questions, to respond to this problem, to complete your purpose? What's your role? Your role as a researcher in qualitative research is to be both data collection instrument and data analyst. So how familiar are you with conducting interviews? How familiar are you with facilitating focus groups? How familiar are you with conducting detailed observation, taking field notes? How familiar are you with drafting survey questions that are open-ended and that will get people responding with detail and depth? So this is your role. You have to facilitate this. You also have to be able to then make people comfortable in your presence, because let's face it, interviews, whether they're recorded, whether they're face-to-face, whether they're virtual, there's an artificiality to this data collection and to these moments and to these interactions that can make people feel uncomfortable. How good are you at putting people at ease so that they feel that they are free to say what they want to say? How good are you at moving the conversation back to the topic if it starts to get and veer off into a rabbit hole? Reflect on the ethical considerations. Everything you do has to keep your participants safe and cared for. If you're dealing with sensitive data, think about how you will debrief them. Think about aftercare and things of that nature. Any data you collect has to be maintained and stored in a private location, regardless of how it is recorded. Think about the ethics and safety issues of disclosing your researcher status. Now, people are moving away from interviewing drug dealers or mafia individuals in their natural settings for the most part, but these studies still happen. And depending on who you're interviewing, and what you're doing, you still need to think about the ethics of asking questions that, depending on the topic, may bring up sensitive issues, that may bring up traumatic reflections, or that may bring up something that you didn't even expect. You need to think about how you're going to validate the data, which is one reason why, yes, you can use AI and automated transcription services, but professional transcription services where people do it help with that. Triangulation, getting further information. All of these things are important. And be open to adapting your data collection plan. You may go into it thinking, okay, interviews are what I need. But maybe after a couple of interviews, you start to realize that, if I were to observe this happening once or twice, I think that would provide me with the actual data that I need. What happens when you change your data collection plan? You've got to go back to the IRB and talk to them about that and get approval for the changes. And last but not least, bring batteries and chargers for any recording device. There is nothing that is more frustrating than being in the middle of an interview, of an observation that you're recording, and having your phone, your recorder, your laptop, your camera just have the battery die on you, and you miss lots of data. So have batteries and chargers to help you mitigate data loss. And these are some of the things I want you to think about as you move through your data collection plans. And last but not least, I do want to mention that Statistics Solutions is a full-service dissertation consulting company providing graduate students and others with timely editorial support for their dissertations and scholarly projects, all the way from topic development to preparing for your final defense and turning your dissertation into a journal article. For information about our services or to receive a complimentary 30-minute consultation that is available between Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Eastern United States time, contact Janine Glace at info@statisticsolutions.com or our 1-800 number, country code 1-877-437-8622. We are out of time. I'd like to thank you for attending. Thank you for being engaged. Thank you for asking such good questions. As a qualitative research mentor, if you choose to engage our services, you will more likely be working with me. So thank you for your time. Sorry we don't have time for any more questions, but you guys asked some amazing questions. Thank you for that. And I hope all of you have a lovely, lovely weekend. And I wish you the most success with your dissertations, with your scholarly career, and with your lives in general. Have a great day and a great weekend. So